very pleased to be joined now by former UFC middleweight champion Rich Franklin, Vice President of One Championship. Very nice to see you, Rich, and interviewing you for the very first time. You're over in the States. We've heard some exciting things for One Championship in terms of the US plans. How's everything going?
Things are going well. I actually, being stationed in Singapore, I bounced to this side of the world just for some personal reasons. I've lived over in Singapore working for One for the last 4.5 years, almost 5 years now. And so I came back here a couple of months ago. I had my home here in the States, and needed to just take care of some personal business, family business, things like that. And then being over here with the efforts that we had going on in the US, I had some things that I started to take care of. And so it's kind of anchored me on this side of the planet for now, because just, doing those kinds of things. Our foray in the US in April really set the stage for us actually coming over here to broadcast on US soil, because those events that we did in the US for TNT were broadcast from Singapore. So now we're actually looking to open up here in the US next year. And so I'm just beginning to plant those seeds and get the ball rolling on things.
There was a big step in July as the Colorado Commission approved One's rule set. So how big of a milestone was that?
This is, it's great for us. I don't believe that Colorado approving our rule set is a big milestone, because our rule set isn't that significantly different as far as performance goes from really any other rule set. The main differences that you see in our rule set is that we allow knees to the head of a grounded opponent. This is a big thing, particularly on this side of the planet. People aren't used to seeing it over here in the States. We do allow 12 to 6 elbows, but even in the unified rules right now, I think they're re-examining that rule with 12 to 6 elbows. But as it applies to the knees, kneeing an opponent to the head on the ground, I don't see how you can really generate more force doing that. I would actually like to see some data on the force that you can generate standing and kneeing somebody in the face, where you have the ability to pull their head towards your knee, generating momentum in both directions, versus on the ground. To me, I would say from a fighter safety perspective, I don't see being kneed in the head on the ground is really any more dangerous. With One Championship's rule sets, illegal targets are pretty standard, things like the back of the head, down the spine, the groin, all that kind of stuff. It's all standard stuff. So when I look at the rule sets from the things you're allowed to do versus the things you're not allowed to do, it's not really that different for me. I think that most of the differences come down to actually a lot of the things that we do on the safety side of things. We do our hydration protocol, which is cutting edge. There's no other organization in the world that does things the way that we do things. With our weigh-ins and stuff like that. And then we also do things like fight week CT scans, which is not something that really, I don't know any other organization that does fight week CT scans. There's always the medical protocols that go with what you need to have done as an athlete weeks out of an event, or possibly months out of an event. Some of these tests that you need to have done are valid for longer periods of time, but One Championship stance on that is like, well, somebody could have suffered some head trauma while they were in camp, approaching fight camp, just a week out of camp or something like that. So we want to test and make sure. And that's obviously a cost that the organization incurs. And then I think the other big cutting edge thing for us is just our rule set, like our judging criteria and how we judge the fights, because anybody who's familiar with the global rule set in One Championship, they know that we don't judge on a round by round basis. We don't use a 10-point must system. We look at the whole fight as one big thing and judge it. So, when the second round begins, from a judging perspective in One Championship, it's not round 2. It's just the 6th minute of the fight that just continues. So there is no stealing rounds or any of that kind of stuff. You can't steal around with a takedown at the end. That gets scored, and then you continue fighting at the 6th minute and continue going. And at the end of the match, whether it's 3 or 5 minute rounds, you render a judgment based on that. And so, when I think of the ecosystem of that, and when I look at these different things, I personally believe, obviously the hydration protocol is superior to everybody else, that every other major organization on the planet. And I'm a big fan of our judging and scoring criteria. Both, I wish I had that as an athlete, but also working as an executive. I believe that between the hydration protocol and the rule system are two major elements as to why we have an 80% finishing rate. Even within our judging criteria, like we have a yellow card and red card system, and you can get yellow carded for fouls, things like kicking somebody in the groin, but you also get yellow carded for things like stalling as well. So it keeps the action moving, and the athletes know that.
There's apparently 10 different rule sets right now. Sorry, you're going to say.
I was just going to say, I don't know if so to go back to your point about Colorado, I like in my mind, I'm like, well, it's not that big of a deal, but it is that starting point that one championship needed to actually get the momentum going in the right direction. So from that perspective, it's a big deal to me. But when I look at it, I'm like, well, we're not like, the rule set's not that. It's like you're not really taking a risk. Actually, I think it's a safer rule set from my perspective. But I don't know, maybe I'm biased. I work for the company.
There's 10 different rule sets apparently in the US right now. Do you see that as a big problem? There was an article in MMA Junkie that interviewed Mark Ratner, the UFC vice president, him saying, there's too many different rules and that's causing a problem for the sport. We need to bring everything in line. Do you subscribe to that?
Well, I'll say this. I mean, first of all, I like Mark. I've known Mark for years. I competed with the UFC when Mark was in charge of all that kind of stuff. He's a very smart man. Do I see it as a problem? Yes and no. I don't see it as a problem as organizations having different rule sets. So, you can compete for one organization and they have a certain kind of rule set, and you can compete for another organization and they have a different rule set. And it doesn't matter. I guess the best example I could think of, and this may not resonate well with fan base in Malaysia, for example, but you take like American football, but there's also Canadian football. Now, there are minor nuance differences between these two leagues in rules. Different kinds of rules. And if you're not very familiar with American style football, then I could start going into how some of the rules are different between the two leagues, and it really wouldn't matter to you. But if you were to watch a game, it would roughly look about the same. If you got into the weeds a little bit, you might notice like, oh, that's a little different, or that's a little different. I think that when you want consistency in the rule set, I think the first thing the primary objective is fighter safety. And when you talk about 10 different rule sets, that's news to me. I didn't know that there were 10 different rule sets in the United States. But the question is how many organizations in the US are using rule sets that are different from a major organization who has a safety record and a track record and a history like a one championship, or even the UFC for that matter, right? I mean, obviously organizations like that go through great lengths to make sure that fighters are safe. And so when I think about it from a fighter safety perspective, I'm like, yeah, it does make sense to have everybody on the same page. And from that perspective, I believe that when we look at fighter safety, I think that our rule set is safer. And you're going to have other people that'll focus in and be like, oh, but you guys allow knees to the head on the ground. It's like, well, if you really want to talk about fighter safety, let's talk about things like weigh-ins. I mean, you see a lot of these athletes that are weighing in on stages and they're getting on scales, they're collapsing. You hear reports of athletes who've had to been taken to the hospital, fights that have been in jeopardy or pulled from cards in these organizations where, just like I did as an athlete, I was cutting 20 plus pounds, over 10, 11 kg to make weight for a fight. And that stuff that's just not healthy for you. It's not healthy for your organs. It's not healthy for when you're rehydrating. One of the last places in the body to rehydrate is the brain cavity, which only increases the severity of concussions and things like that. So it definitely has long-term ramifications on the body. So yeah, I mean, I guess I kind of agree with Mark that we should look at the rule set and think of it from a fighter safety perspective and kind of come to a conclusion on those kind of things.
I feel like one does a good job to always kind of assess where they're at and what they're doing and how it can be improved. We've seen many changes over the years, right? There seems to be two schools of thought with the weight cutting. On the one side, there's massive praise for what one is doing. In fact, that it's potentially saving lives, that it's actually making for more fun fights. On the other side, there's still criticism that there's maybe not enough transparency. Although in recent years, one started being more transparent about weight cutting. There's also, some accusations for Angela Lee that she missed weight a few times. Overall, where do you feel one is at with the weight cutting? Are you very pleased with the progress being made? And would you like to see anything else be, progressed?
Yeah, I think prior to COVID, actually, we started live streaming the weigh-in hydration process on our Facebook or something like that. Like it was live streamed so that people could actually watch that stuff. It's not as exciting as a weigh-in where you're stepping on scales, obviously, because people are literally, the way the hydration protocol works is you have 2 days before the fight that you have to make weight and hydration. So the order is this: you walk in, you go into the bathroom, you pee, that urine is tested, it's collected and tested, and it's a simple test. It's tested with an instrument called a refractometer. They test the specific gravity of the urine. So essentially what they're doing is they're testing the urine for how much solvent is in the urine. It checks, the more solvent there is, the more dehydrated you are. So you have to be below a certain marker, and then after you pee, you step on weight. Now, we do have some athletes that have trouble making weight because they're on that cusp of that weight class, and there have been times where Angela had difficulties making weight. I think Estela Nunes had some words to say about that recently in an article. But if just to look at the facts of the case, when she talked about competing against Angela, there are a couple things going on here. That was back in 2017, and she talked about Angela actually at straw weight, and she said that Angela weighed a certain amount of weight. That fight wasn't even at straw weight; it was at atom weight. And so it was a different weight class, and so she couldn't have actually weighed in the weight that Estella claimed that she did. But Angela did actually make weight for that, and with transparency in one championship system, just for all the fans to know. If you're competing, you can have someone from your camp present when your opponent is weighing in and doing their hydration. And so that's as transparent as you can get between opponents. So if you ever have any questions about whether your athlete was going to make weight or not, or prior to the match, if you think like, oh, I'm not sure they're going to be able to make weight, then you should appoint one of your coaches to say, stick around, check the hydration, make sure she makes hydration, and check the weigh-in, because I want my people to sign off on that. And they have the ability to do that. So with the process, it's about as transparent as you can get. What ends up happening is a lot of these athletes just assume like, nah, I'm not going to have somebody stick around. I got things to do today. I got to work out. I got this, I got whatever. And so they move on with their life. And then suddenly it's like, well, wait a minute. How do I actually know she made weight? It's like, well, you should have had somebody stick around to double check that and flag it if necessary, because then you can sign off on it. Someone from your own camp can sign off on it.
That's interesting. That's interesting to know. In terms of kind of one assessing things and always looking to grow and put in the best systems possible. I remember a fight between Tim Sylvia and Andrei Arlovsky. It was a no contest. Arlovsky went for the soccer kick. He didn't have the all clear from the referee. And after that moment, one then changed that rule, and then for years you could do soccer kicks, and 5 years later I think soccer kicks were outlawed. How do you feel about that in general, continuing on from our discussion of knees to a grounded opponent? Were you an advocate for soccer kicks? Do you think Ryzen loves them, right? Pride loved them, or do you think it shouldn't be a part of MMA?
Let me answer this from a philosophical perspective first. Do I believe really that you can generate more force by kicking somebody on the ground than you can on the feet? I don't know. I mean, you see some of these knockouts in any organization across the board, but look at the Georgia Petrosian knockout that was just recent, right? I mean, could that have connected any more effectively if he was actually laying down? I don't know. The Arlovsky and Tim Sylvia match was before I actually joined the organization. But I don't think that either way, however you want to argue soccer kicks for, a kick to the head of a grounded opponent, for anybody that may not be familiar with that term, I just don't, either way, whether it's safer or more dangerous, or whatever, I don't want to get into that kind of discussion. I'm not here to make that. I kind of question it. Like, is it really? I'm not sure. But I will say this, something the public is definitely not ready for. But keep in mind, I came up in the MMA like during an era where it was compared to human cockfighting. John McCain compared mixed martial arts to human cockfighting at that time. And when the 4-ounce gloves were developed, which is just standard now, at that point in time, people are like, oh my gosh, the fingers are open. There's almost no padding. Like, this is dangerous. And at that point in time, we were arguing, like the argument was, you actually, if you look at the punch stats of, say, a boxing match to an MMA match, the head trauma that you would experience in an MMA match is far less significant than that of a boxing match. So, you're going to argue that this is actually, from a combative side, from a full contact sport, safer. And, you could almost kind of like take a similar argument like that to something like soccer kicks, but the public's not ready for it. So when I came into the organization, I knew there was only a matter of time until that rule got changed.
It was interesting, the timing. We saw Aljamain Sterling get kneed in the head, and that, the Peter Yan fight was called no contest. And then it was awarded a DQ win for Aljo. And then we had DJ, getting kneed in the head by Adriano Moraes. And DJ afterwards said, look, I love this rule. And he was on the wrong end of it, which I thought was fascinating. So if you were working for the UFC, would you advocate for them to actually look at that rule and start to integrate a similar rule set as one championship in that regard?
I would. I mean, the things that if I was working for another organization, the things that I would bring up is like, number one, I'd bring up the judging system. I would bring up how the 10-point must system is flawed. In a 3-round MMA match, it's difficult. If you squeak out a victory in rounds 1, rounds 2, and then you overwhelmingly lose in round 3, let's just say that you run out of gas and your opponent just steamrolls over you. It's like, well, unless that ends up being scored a 10-8 round, which is rare in MMA, even still, if you won the first 2 rounds 10-9, 10-9, it's like, well, you're kind of even score here, or you actually win by majority decision or whatever because it's 2 rounds to 1. It depends on how many refs. Obviously, it could be a unanimous decision 2 rounds to 1, but you get the understanding. So I would talk about those kinds of things as it pertains to knees to the head. You would start having questions about these kind of techniques. Take the 12-6 elbows, for example. They're not legal in the unified rule set. I believe that part of the reason why that was stricken from the rules is because the idea or the philosophy behind it was, well, if a fighter shoots in and they get sprawled on top of, that you can deliver a downward elbow. But you also have these illegal targets like the back of the head and the spine. The back of the head extends all the way down the spine. So if you can't target an illegal target, how is that elbow any more dangerous? Like if you come in and hit somebody like in a trap or a shoulder or something like that, what more damage can you do? So you ask yourself, like, why does this rule really exist? Truly, why does it exist? Even if I'm in a standing position and I do a standard, what might be a 12-6 elbow, as long as I put a slight arc in that elbow when I'm coming forward, it's not technically a 12-6 elbow. So you get into these nuances where you're like, well, why does this really exist? Apply that logic to knees to the head of a grounded opponent. And you start thinking like, well, is somebody really more exposed? I mean, you think about DJ, you brought that up, getting knee to the head. DJ got knee to the head. He lost that fight. He got up and he walked right out of the circle that night. You look at another knockout, we've seen it in organizations across the board. Somebody gets clipped with a kick to the head and they're out cold. And people that have to be carted out of, taken out of the cage. So, and those are perfectly legal techniques. So when I see, and I look at an example like that, I'm like, does this really put the athletes in any more danger? Why not be able to implement this rule? It would definitely change it changes the game. You don't have the ability anymore to sit, to shoot in on somebody and them sprawl on top of you, and you just play that game where I'm going to put my hand down. I'm going to put my hand down, and now I have another point of contact, because you can just kind of stall out the action there. Here you can't. The moment that happens, the knees are coming in, so you're immediately making different choices to keep your offense going, or you don't take that shot to begin with so that you don't put yourself in that position. So it will slightly change the dynamic of things. I'm a fan of it. I like the way that it keeps the action moving. Even as an athlete, I always wondered why that was never legal to begin with, because even if I shoot in and I'm down and the back of my head is exposed, I can't knee to the back of the head anyway, so I'm protected by the illegal target rules. So yeah, I would look at that stuff. But before I started trying to encourage that implementation, once again, I would be like, let's talk about judging. Let's talk about scoring. Let's talk about hydration protocols. Because when you think about things, right? I'll ask you this question. In MMA, there's a 10-point must system. By what criteria does a judge award one athlete 10 and another athlete 9? Do you know?
No.
Exactly. And you know what? I competed in that system my entire career, and I never knew, what do I need to do to actually get a 10 versus a 9? If I land more punches than this guy, but he lands a couple more kicks than me, what determines, how does the judge reason, oh, that's a 10 and that's a 9? Particularly when that system came from boxing to begin with. And at the time where I was competing, most of those guys who were judging only had experience in a boxing community.